The city air was a blade of ice, sharp and unforgiving against Alara's cheek. Every breath she took felt like swallowing shards of glass, a painful reminder of the biting December cold that had settled deep into the bones of the world. She pulled the thin collar of her coat tighter around her neck, a futile gesture against a wind that seemed to mock the threadbare fabric. The coat, once a warm shade of gray, had long since faded to a weary, defeated color that matched the sky above. Its buttons were strained, its seams were weary, and it offered more memory of warmth than actual protection. Beside her, a small hand was tucked firmly inside her own. Leo, her son, was a beacon of warmth in the encroaching twilight. His small 5-year-old body was bundled in layers of clothing, making him look like a miniature, puffy explorer on an Arctic expedition. His cheeks were rosy, not just from the cold, but from the pure, unadulterated excitement that only a child on Christmas Eve could possess. His eyes, wide and luminous, were fixed on the glowing shop windows that lined the street, each one a miniature universe of light and promise. Alara's heart ached with a familiar, heavy blend of love and fear. Looking at him was like looking at the sun. His brightness filled her, but the intensity of her need to protect him, to provide for him, was a constant, burning anxiety. She was exhausted. It was a deep, cellular exhaustion that went far beyond lack of sleep. It was the weariness of 1,000 skipped meals, 100 sleepless nights spent staring at a ceiling full of cracks, and one relentless, looping question. How would they get through this? Her job at the diner had cut her hours again, a casualty of the slow season. The tips, which she had once relied on to bridge the gap between rent and everything else, had dwindled to a pathetic collection of loose change. Her last paycheck had been devoured by their landlord, a man with a perpetually sour face and no patience for sob stories. Now her pockets were empty, save for a single crisp $10 bill folded neatly in the worn lining of her glove. $10. It was everything she had left in the world. It was the last barrier between her and absolute zero. The weight of that small piece of paper felt immense, a fragile shield against the crushing reality of their poverty. It was meant for groceries, for a carton of milk and a loaf of bread that might stretch for a few days if she was careful, if she ate only the crusts and let Leo have the soft centers. But it was also meant for something else. It was meant for a promise. Weeks ago, Leo had pressed his small nose against the frosted glass of a toy shop window. His breath had created a perfect steamy circle on the pane, and through it, he had seen his heart's desire. It was not a flashy, battery-operated marvel. It was a simple thing, a small wooden train painted a cheerful, glossy red. It had 6 little wheels and a tiny, smiling face painted on the front. To Alara, it was just a block of wood. To Leo, it was magic. He had talked about it ever since. He named it Rory the Red Engine. He told her stories about Rory's adventures, how he would chug through imaginary mountains made of pillows and cross vast oceans of blue carpet. His belief in Rory was so pure, so absolute, that it had become a symbol for Alara. It was a symbol of the innocence she was so desperate to protect. The last flicker of childhood magic in a life that was becoming increasingly harsh and colorless. She had promised him. With a certainty she did not feel, she had looked into his hopeful eyes and said, "If you are a very good boy, maybe Santa will bring you Rory for Christmas." It was a gamble, a prayer whispered into the void. And now Christmas Eve was here, and Santa's sleigh, she knew, was powered by $10. That bill was a crossroads. It represented 2 possible futures. In one, Leo woke up on Christmas morning to find Rory the Red Engine waiting for him, his faith in magic and promises intact. His squeal of delight would be the only warmth in their cold little apartment. In the other, they had bread and milk, a meager defense against the hunger that was a constant, gnawing presence. There was no third option. The toy train cost exactly $9.99. It was as if the universe was presenting her with the clearest, cruelest possible choice. As they walked, the long, golden shadows of late afternoon stretched across the snow-dusted sidewalks. The city was aglow with festive lights, and the sound of distant carols drifted on the wind. For everyone else, it seemed, this was a time of joy and abundance. For Alara, it was a time of stark, painful contrast. Every happy family she saw, laden with colorful shopping bags, was a fresh twist of the knife in her heart. She felt invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's celebration. "Mommy, look!" Leo's voice, clear as a bell, pulled her from her thoughts. He was pointing at the very toy shop, its windows a blaze of warm, inviting light. And there, nestled on a bed of fake cotton snow, was Rory. He seemed to be smiling right at them. "There he is, sweetie," she managed, her voice tight. "There's Rory." Leo's entire body vibrated with joy. He jumped up and down, his small boots making soft thudding sounds on the pavement. "Can we get him now, so Santa knows exactly which one?" Alara's throat closed up. The lie felt heavy on her tongue. How could she explain that Santa was a tired woman with a single $10 bill? How could she watch the light in his eyes dim when she told him they couldn't? She couldn't. Not yet. "Let's just walk a little more, honey. The store will be open for a while." She needed to stall, to think. But thinking was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind was a fog of worry, a tangled mess of numbers that never added up. Rent was due in a week. The electric bill was already late. The $10 was not a solution. It was a single flimsy patch on a ship that was already sinking. She steered him away from the magnetic pull of the toy shop, promising they would come back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She felt the cold seep through her worn boots, a damp chill that traveled up her legs. The world felt hard, unforgiving, a place of sharp edges and cold surfaces. All she wanted was to provide one small, soft, happy moment for her son. One perfect Christmas morning. Was that too much to ask? The city, in its glittering, indifferent beauty, seemed to answer. Yes, it was. They rounded a corner, away from the bustling main street, and onto a quieter side avenue where the festive decorations were sparser. Here the wind seemed to have more room to howl, and it whipped around the tall buildings with a mournful cry. It was here, at a lonely, windswept bus stop, that Alara saw him. He was an old man, huddled on the cold metal bench, as if trying to make himself as small as possible. His frame was frail, lost inside a thin, dark overcoat that looked as inadequate as her own. A dusting of snow had settled on his hunched shoulders and in the white hair that peeked out from under a simple wool cap. He was trembling, a constant, violent shudder that shook his entire body. His face, etched with a web of deep lines, was a pale, bluish-gray color that spoke of a cold that had gone far beyond simple discomfort. He wasn't waiting for a bus. His eyes, watery and unfocused, stared blankly at the street. He seemed lost, not just in the city, but within himself. A gust of wind hit the bus shelter and he flinched, his hands fumbling with the pockets of his coat. He pulled them out empty, his expression one of confusion and rising panic. He was looking for something he couldn't find. Alara's steps faltered. She felt a powerful magnetic pull toward him, a current of empathy so strong it was almost a physical force. She saw in his fragile form a reflection of her own vulnerability, the same battle against a world that was too cold, too hard. Leo, oblivious, chattered on about Rory the train, his happy voice a stark contrast to the silent desperation on the old man's face. She hesitated. Her mission was clear: get the train, go home, and pretend for one day that their lives were not hanging by a thread. This man was not her responsibility. She had her own burdens, a weight so heavy she could barely carry it. Walking away was the logical thing to do. It was the only thing to do. She had a child to think of, but her feet would not move. She watched as the man tried to stand, his legs wobbling beneath him. He swayed, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to fall into the street. He caught himself on the pole of the bus stop sign, his breath coming in ragged white puffs. He was in trouble. Real, immediate trouble. The internal debate was a storm inside her. On one side was Leo's face, alight with the promise of Christmas magic. The image of his smile, the sound of his joyous laughter upon seeing the little red train was a powerful anchor. It was the one good thing she could create in their bleak world. It was her promise to him, a mother's promise. On the other side was this stranger, this elderly man, shivering so hard it looked painful. What if he was sick? What if he was suffering from dementia and had wandered away from home? What if he collapsed right here on this frozen sidewalk? Could she live with herself if she walked away? Could she teach her son about goodness and kindness if she failed to practice it when it mattered most? The $10 bill in her glove felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. It was such a small amount of money, yet it held the power of a life-altering choice. It could buy a toy, a symbol of hope for a child. Or it could buy a taxi ride for a freezing old man. It could buy him warmth. It could buy him safety. It could, perhaps, even save his life. She looked from the distant, glowing toy shop back to the trembling figure at the bus stop. The conflict was tearing her apart. Her love for her son was a primal, fierce thing, a force of nature that guided her every action, but her compassion, the very core of her character, was screaming at her to act. She thought of all the times strangers had shown her small kindnesses, a held door, a shared smile, the cashier who let her slide when she was a few cents short. These were the moments that had kept her from shattering completely. "Mommy, are we going back for Rory?" Leo's voice was small, questioning. He could sense her sudden stillness, her inner turmoil. She looked down at him, at his innocent, trusting face. What was the more important gift to give him? A wooden toy, or an example of what it meant to be a good human being? The answer came to her with a sudden, painful clarity. The train was a temporary joy. A lesson in compassion was a gift that would last a lifetime. The decision settled over her, not with ease, but with a profound sense of rightness. The weight in her chest did not disappear, but it shifted, transformed from anxiety into resolve. Taking a deep breath that stung her lungs, she squeezed Leo's hand. "Just a minute, sweetie. I think that man needs our help." She walked toward the bus stop, her steps now firm and purposeful. The old man looked up as she approached, his eyes filled with a hazy confusion. He seemed startled, like a frightened animal. Alara softened her expression, offering him a small, gentle smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice quiet so as not to alarm him. "Are you all right? You look very cold." The man blinked slowly, as if struggling to process her words. I think I'm lost," he murmured, his voice a dry, reedy whisper. "I need to get home, but I can't remember. I don't have the fare." His hand patted his empty pocket again, a gesture of helpless frustration. Alara's heart broke for him. She reached into her glove and pulled out the $10 bill. The paper was warm from her hand, a stark contrast to the frigid air. She held it out to him. "Here," she said softly. "Please, take this. It's not much, but it should be enough to get you a taxi. You need to get somewhere warm right away." The old man stared at the money, then at her face, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. He looked at her worn coat, at the small bundled child standing beside her. He could see the struggle etched into the lines around her eyes. He shook his head, his trembling hand waving the offer away. "No, no, I couldn't possibly," he rasped. You have a child. You need this." "We're okay," Alara insisted, her voice gaining a gentle strength. She took his hand. It was as cold as ice, the skin thin and papery. She carefully folded his fingers around the bill, pressing it firmly into his palm. "Please, you need it more than we do. It's Christmas Eve. Let someone help you." Tears welled in the old man's eyes, freezing almost instantly on his wrinkled cheeks. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his gaze she saw a flicker of profound gratitude. He could only nod, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. "Get home safe," she said, giving his hand one last, reassuring squeeze. She turned away, taking Leo's hand again, and started walking. She did not look back. She couldn't. If she did, the enormity of her sacrifice might overwhelm her. As they walked away from the bus stop, a strange calm descended upon Alara. The frantic energy that had been coursing through her was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. The city lights seemed to blur, each one a soft watercolor orb in the gathering dark. She had given away their last $10. They had nothing, and yet she felt lighter than she had in months. She had made the right choice. In the silent calculus of the human heart, she knew she had chosen correctly. The image of the old man's tear-filled eyes was now etched in her mind, and it brought not regret, but a sense of profound connection. In that small, desperate moment, two strangers had met, and one had chosen kindness over self-preservation. "Mommy?" Leo's voice was quiet beside her. "Are we not getting Rory?" Alara stopped and knelt down in the snow so she was at his eye level. She brushed a stray snowflake from his eyelashes. The lie she had dreaded telling was no longer necessary. Now there was only the truth, and she hoped he was old enough to understand some small part of it. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We gave our money to that man because he was cold and lost, and he needed to get home to his family. That was the most important thing to do." Leo looked back toward the bus stop, his small brow furrowed in thought. He was quiet for a long moment. Alara held her breath, waiting for the tears, for the inevitable wave of childish disappointment, but it never came. Instead, he looked back at her, his expression serious. "Was he one of Santa's helpers, Mommy, testing if we were good?" Alara was so taken aback by the simple, beautiful innocence of his question that she could only stare at him for a second. A laugh, genuine and relieved, escaped her lips. She pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his scarf. "Yes, Leo," she whispered into his ear, the words catching in her throat. "I think maybe he was." She stood up, her heart feeling both empty and incredibly full at the same time. The toy shop was far behind them now, its warm light swallowed by the distance. Their apartment was a long walk away, and the prospect of a Christmas morning with no gifts and very little food was a harsh reality waiting for them. But as they walked home, hand in hand through the falling snow, Alara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the quiet, resilient peace that comes from knowing you have done a good thing, no matter the cost. Unseen by Alara, a sleek black car had been cruising slowly down the adjacent street. The man behind the wheel, Julian Vance, had a knot of ice in his stomach. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning every face on the sidewalk, every shadow in every doorway. He was searching for his father, Arthur. Julian's life was a fortress of control and order. He ran a multi-billion-dollar corporation with ruthless efficiency, his days scheduled down to the minute. His emotions were kept under a similar rigid lock and key, but his father's illness had shattered that control. Arthur's mind, once a brilliant strategic instrument that had built an empire from nothing, was now a fragile, unpredictable thing. He would wander, chasing ghosts of memory, and Julian lived in a constant state of low-grade terror, waiting for the phone call that would tell him his father was lost or hurt. He had left his father at home with a caregiver only an hour ago, just to run a quick errand. But Arthur was clever. He had slipped out, disappearing into the cold December evening. Julian's frantic calls to the caregiver had confirmed his worst fears. Now he was driving in circles, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a rhythm that sounded an awful lot like fear. He turned onto the quieter side avenue, his gaze sweeping the street, and then he saw him, his father standing at a bus stop, looking dazed. A wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over Julian. He pulled the car to a sharp, silent stop at the curb, his eyes fixed on Arthur. But as he watched, he saw something else. He saw a woman, a young mother with a small child, approach his father. Julian's hand went to the door handle, his body tensing. His first instinct was suspicion. His father was a wealthy man, and there were always people looking to take advantage. He watched, his eyes narrowed as the woman spoke to his father. He saw her reach into her pocket. He saw her press something into Arthur's hand. He saw the gentle, reassuring way she touched his arm. He expected his father to look angry or confused. Instead, he saw tears on his father's face. He saw an expression of such raw, humbled gratitude that it stunned him into stillness. He watched the woman and her child walk away, disappearing into the snowy twilight. They were just another anonymous pair in the city, swallowed by the night. Julian waited a moment before getting out of the car. He approached his father slowly. "Dad, are you okay?" Arthur looked up, his eyes clearing slightly as he recognized his son. "Julian, I got a bit turned around." "I know, Dad. Let's get you home." Julian put a steadying arm around his father's shoulders, guiding him toward the warmth of the car. As he did, he noticed the $10 bill, clutched tightly in Arthur's fist. "What's this?" Julian asked, his voice gentle. Arthur looked down at the money as if seeing it for the first time. "An angel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to me. She said I needed it more. She had a little boy. They didn't have anything. You could see it, and she gave me her last money." He pointed a trembling finger in the direction Alara had gone. "She saved me, Julian." Julian stared at the $10 bill. It was a paltry sum to him, less than the cost of the coffee he drank every morning. But in that moment, it felt like the most valuable thing in the world. This woman, this stranger, who clearly had nothing, had shown his father a kindness that no amount of money could ever buy. It was a pure, selfless act, a tiny flame of decency in a cold, indifferent world. And it had been offered to his father. A feeling he couldn't quite name stirred within him. It was a mixture of shame for his initial suspicion and a deep, aching admiration for the woman. He helped his father into the passenger seat and then got back behind the wheel. But instead of driving home, he began to drive slowly in the direction the woman had walked. "What are you doing?" Arthur asked, his voice stronger now that he was out of the biting wind. "I want to find her," Julian said, his voice quiet but intense. "I just want to thank her." He drove for several blocks, his eyes scanning the sparse crowds. It was a hopeless task, he knew. She could be anywhere, but he couldn't let it go. The image of her gentle smile, the dignity in her posture, even in her worn-out coat, was burned into his mind. And then he saw her. She was further down the street, walking with her head bowed against the wind, the little boy trudging bravely beside her. There was a weariness in her walk that spoke of a long, hard day and a long, hard life. Without thinking, Julian pulled the car over to the curb just ahead of them. He got out of the car, the cold air hitting him like a physical blow. He was wearing a cashmere overcoat that cost more than her rent for a year, but for the first time he felt utterly inadequate. Alara saw the luxury car stop and a tall, well-dressed man get out. Her first instinct was to pull Leo closer, a protective gesture born of habit. She assumed he was lost and needed directions. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice deeper and softer than she would have expected. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe you helped my father a few minutes ago, at the bus stop." Alara was stunned into silence. She looked from his handsome, serious face to the car, where she could see the old man sitting in the passenger seat, watching them. He offered her a small, grateful wave. "Oh," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Is he all right?" "He is now, thanks to you," Julian said. His gaze was direct, and in his dark eyes she saw not pity, but a profound respect that was more startling than any other emotion would have been. "My name is Julian Vance. That's my father, Arthur. I'm Alara, and this is Leo." She felt a blush creep up her neck, suddenly self-conscious of her shabby coat and the run-down neighborhood they were in. "You're walking in this cold," Julian stated, his tone gentle. "Please let me give you a ride home. It's the very least I can do." Alara's pride, the one thing she had left that was entirely her own, rose up. "Thank you, that's very kind, but we're fine. We don't live far." She did not want to be a charity case. She did not want this wealthy, imposing man to see the bleakness of her apartment building, the poverty she tried so hard to hide from the world. Julian saw the refusal in her eyes, but he also saw the dignity behind it. He was struck by her quiet strength. She had nothing, yet she refused his help. He had everything, yet he had been powerless to protect his own father. The contrast was not lost on him. He didn't push. He simply nodded. "All right, but please, allow me to properly thank you another time." He reached into his wallet, but something stopped him. Offering her money now felt cheap, insulting. It would tarnish the purity of her act. She hadn't done it for a reward. Instead, he just looked at her, memorizing her face. The tired lines around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the way a stray curl of honey-blonde hair had escaped her hat. "Thank you, Alara," he said again, his voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "You have no idea what you did tonight." He got back into his car and drove away, leaving Alara and Leo standing on the sidewalk in a cloud of exhaust. Alara watched the red taillights disappear, her heart pounding. The encounter had been surreal, a strange and unexpected postscript to her difficult decision. She took Leo's hand and continued their walk home, the weight of the man's intense gaze still lingering on her. She had no idea that this brief, snowy encounter was not an ending, but the beginning of everything. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned cold and gray. Alara's apartment was silent save for the gentle hiss of the radiator that provided more noise than heat. She had been awake for hours, lying in bed and staring at the faint light filtering through the thin curtains. The peace she had felt the night before had evaporated with the morning sun, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. There was no food in the refrigerator. There was no gift under the tiny, scraggly tree she had salvaged from a neighbor's trash. Leo was still asleep, his small face peaceful in the dim light. Alara's heart ached. She had failed him. She had chosen a stranger over her own son, and this was the consequence, a barren, joyless Christmas morning. The lesson in compassion she had hoped to teach him felt hollow now. A lofty ideal that couldn't fill an empty stomach. Meanwhile, across the city in a sprawling penthouse apartment overlooking the park, Julian Vance was also awake. He hadn't slept well. The image of Alara's face, her quiet dignity in the face of such obvious hardship, had haunted his dreams. He sat in his sterile, minimalist living room, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, and thought about the $10 bill now sitting on his desk. His father, Arthur, was sitting in a comfortable armchair, wrapped in a warm blanket. He was more lucid this morning, the confusion of the previous night having receded. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Arthur said, his voice raspy. Julian looked at his father. "I am. It's not right, Dad, that a person like that, someone so fundamentally good, should have so little, and we have so much." The words felt inadequate to express the profound sense of injustice that had taken root in him. "Then do something about it," Arthur said simply. "Your mother, she always believed that wealth was not a privilege but a responsibility, a tool to be used for good. You run a foundation for that very purpose. Don't just think about it, Julian. Do something." His father's words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent years running the Vance Foundation, signing checks and attending galas, but it had all felt distant, abstract. He was managing a legacy, not living a purpose. Alara's simple act of kindness had felt more real, more impactful than anything he had done in years. An idea began to form in his mind, a plan that was both audacious and perfectly logical. He stood up, his movements suddenly filled with a purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "You're right," he said. "Let's go." "Go where?" Arthur asked, surprised. "To find her." Julian went to the kitchen and began to fill a large wicker basket with food from his own well-stocked pantry. Bread, cheese, fruit, a roasted chicken from the deli downstairs. He then went to his study and retrieved a beautifully wrapped gift. It was a replica of a vintage steam engine he had bought for a collection, an expensive, intricate model. It wasn't Rory, but it was a train. They had no address, only a vague idea of the neighborhood where he had seen her. They drove back to the area, the sleek black car looking entirely out of place among the run-down apartment buildings and graffiti-covered walls. Julian felt a pang of guilt. He lived in a different universe from the people here. "How will we ever find her?" Arthur asked, looking out the window. "We'll ask," Julian said, his determination unwavering. He parked the car and they got out. He approached a woman shoveling her walkway. He described Alara and Leo, the worn gray coat, the little boy bundled in blue. The woman looked at him suspiciously at first, but something in his earnest expression must have convinced her. "Sounds like Alara," she said, pointing a mitten-clad finger toward a drab brick building at the end of the block. "Apartment 3B. She's a good kid, having a real tough time of it." Julian thanked her, his heart pounding a little faster. He and Arthur walked to the building, the basket of food feeling both heavy and inadequate in his hands. They climbed the 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs. The hallway smelled of dampness and boiled cabbage. He stopped in front of the door to 3B and hesitated for a moment, suddenly nervous. What if she was offended? What if she saw this as charity and slammed the door in his face? He took a deep breath and knocked. Inside, the sound of the knock made Alara jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her landlord, the police? Her mind raced through a dozen terrible possibilities. She opened the door a crack, her body tensed, ready to slam it shut. And then she saw him. Julian Vance, the man from the night before, stood in her dreary hallway, looking even more imposing and out of place than he had on the street. Beside him was his father, Arthur, the old man from the bus stop. "Mr. Vance?" she stammered, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene. "Please call me Julian," he said, his voice soft. He offered her a small, tentative smile. "And this is my father, Arthur. We hope we're not intruding, but we wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas and to thank you again properly." He held up the basket of food. "We brought a few things." Alara was speechless. She could only stare at the abundance in the basket, the smell of fresh bread and roasted chicken filling her small apartment. Leo, awakened by the voices, came padding out from the bedroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He stopped dead when he saw the old man. "It's Santa's helper," he whispered in awe. Arthur's face broke into a wide, genuine smile. He knelt down, wincing slightly so he was on Leo's level. "Hello there, young man. I'm not a helper, but I know Santa, and he told me a very brave boy named Leo was hoping for this." From behind his back, he produced the wrapped gift. Leo's eyes went wide. He looked at Alara for permission. She was still in a state of shock, but she nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Leo took the gift and carefully tore off the paper. When he saw the train, a gasp of pure delight escaped his lips. It wasn't Rory, but it was magnificent. Alara finally found her voice. You shouldn't have. This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Julian said, his gaze sweeping over the small, bare apartment. He saw the single, threadbare sofa, the tiny kitchenette, the palpable sense of struggle that clung to the very air in the room. His resolve hardened. "Alara, may we come in for a moment? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." She stepped aside, and they entered her home. She felt a wave of shame at its shabbiness, but there was nothing to be done. Julian didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on her. They sat, Julian and Arthur on the lumpy sofa, Alara on a hard wooden chair. "My father told me what you did," Julian began, his tone becoming more serious. "You gave him your last $10. You sacrificed a gift for your son to help a complete stranger. In my line of work, I meet a lot of people. Most of them are looking out for themselves. What you did, it's a rare quality." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I run my family's charitable foundation. We support communities, fund shelters, help people who are struggling, but it's all run from an office tower. It's impersonal. We need people on the ground, people who understand what it's really like. People with heart." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Alara, I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job. I want you to come work for the Vance Foundation. I need an outreach coordinator, someone to be a bridge between us and the people we're trying to help. Someone with your empathy, your character. The salary would be more than enough to give you and Leo a comfortable life, a new apartment, everything you need." The room fell silent. The only sound was the happy chugging noise Leo was making as he pushed his new train across the floor. Alara stared at Julian, certain she must be dreaming. This couldn't be real. People like her didn't get rescued. Life didn't work that way. Miracles were for storybooks. Tears began to well in her eyes, hot and fast. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a hope so overwhelming it was painful. She looked at her son, playing happily on the floor, oblivious to the fact that their entire world was shifting on its axis. She looked at Arthur, who was watching her with kind, encouraging eyes. And she looked at Julian, a man who had seen her at her lowest, and had not offered pity, but opportunity. Respect. "Why?" she whispered, the word choked with emotion. "Why me?" "Because you're the kind of person we need more of in the world," Julian said simply, his voice filled with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Because you showed my father kindness when he was vulnerable, and you asked for nothing in return. That's not a skill you can learn. You either have it or you don't. You have it, Alara." A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. The fear and exhaustion that had been her constant companions for so long began to recede, replaced by a fragile, fluttering hope. It was a new beginning, a chance. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked directly at Julian. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Yes, I accept." The first few weeks at the Vance Foundation were a whirlwind for Alara. She was given a bright, spacious office with a window that overlooked the city, a view that still made her feel dizzy with disbelief. The salary that appeared in her new bank account was more money than she had ever seen in her life. She immediately moved out of the cramped, drafty apartment and into a clean, warm two-bedroom in a safe neighborhood, with a small park nearby. For the first time in years, she could walk into a grocery store and fill her cart without the frantic, humiliating process of adding up the cost of every item in her head. She bought Leo a new winter coat, proper boots that kept his feet dry, and a bed of his own. These simple acts of provision filled her with a profound, bone-deep satisfaction that was almost spiritual. But it was the work itself that truly transformed her. She was not just a charity case who had been given a handout. She was a valued member of a team. Julian was true to his word. Her role was to be the heart of the foundation. She visited shelters, community centers, and soup kitchens, listening to people's stories, identifying their real needs. She had a natural gift for it. Her own experiences had given her an empathy that was authentic and powerful. People trusted her because they sensed she was one of them. Julian watched her blossom. He had hired her on an impulse, a gut feeling born from a moment of intense emotion on Christmas Eve. But he quickly realized it was the single best decision he had ever made for the foundation. Her insights were invaluable. She brought a human perspective to their work that had been sorely lacking. She wasn't just implementing programs, she was changing lives, one small, compassionate act at a time. Their relationship remained professional, but a quiet, unspoken connection grew between them. Julian found himself making excuses to stop by her office just to ask how her day was going. He loved watching her talk about her work, her face animated with passion. He would often offer her and Leo a ride home, using the excuse that it was on his way, even when it wasn't. During those car rides, the conversation would drift from work to more personal things. He learned about Leo's love for dinosaurs, about Alara's dream of one day finishing the college degree she had abandoned when she became a mother. She, in turn, learned small things about him, his love for old black-and-white movies, his frustration with his father's stubborn refusal to accept the full extent of his illness. He began bringing small gifts, not extravagant things, but thoughtful ones. A bag of fresh oranges from a farmer's market he'd passed, a picture book about a friendly brontosaurus for Leo, a thermos of hot coffee on a particularly cold morning. Each small gesture was a carefully laid stone, building a bridge across the vast social and economic chasm that separated them. One evening, they were the last two left in the office, finishing up a proposal for a new housing initiative. The city lights twinkled below them, a carpet of diamonds spread out against the velvet darkness. The mood was quiet, intimate. "You seem different," Alara said softly, looking at him from across the large conference table. "Happier than when I first met you." Julian looked out the window, a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "I am," he admitted, his voice low. "For a long time, I think I was just existing, going through the motions, running the company, managing the foundation, taking care of my father. It was all a series of duties to be performed." He turned to look at her, his gaze intense. "My mother died when I was 10. She was the heart of our family. After she was gone, my father just disappeared into his work. He provided everything money could buy, but he was never really there. I grew up in a big, empty house, feeling like a ghost. I learned to lock everything away, to not need anyone." He hesitated, as if unaccustomed to such honesty. "Seeing you with Leo, the way you love him, the sacrifices you were willing to make for him, and for my father, a stranger, it reminded me of what's actually important. It woke something up in me." Alara's heart went out to him. She saw past the wealthy, powerful magnate and saw the lonely boy he had been. "My story isn't so different," she found herself saying, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Leo's father left when I told him I was pregnant. He said he wasn't ready to be a father. I was completely alone. I was so scared. There were times I thought we wouldn't make it. That loneliness. It's a cold, heavy thing to carry. In that moment, they were not an employer and an employee. They were two people who understood the shape of each other's scars. His from an excess of material things and a poverty of affection. Hers from a lack of everything but a fierce, protective love. They had both been profoundly alone. A bond, forged in shared vulnerability, was sealed between them. From that night on, something shifted. The kindness in Julian's eyes was no longer just respectful, it was tender. The comfortable silence between them became charged with unspoken feelings. He started spending more time with his own father, with Alara's gentle encouragement. She would suggest he take Arthur to the park or to a museum. She helped him see that what his father needed wasn't another caregiver, but his son. Slowly, tentatively, the two men began to repair their fractured relationship. Arthur, in his moments of lucidity, saw the change in Julian, and he knew Alara was the cause. Leo, for his part, had come to adore Julian. He would wait by the window in the evenings, watching for Julian's car. Julian would sit on the floor with him, helping him build elaborate train tracks that snaked through the living room. He would listen to Leo's endless stories with a patient, genuine interest that made the little boy's face shine. He was the father figure Leo had never had, a steady, kind, and reliable presence in their lives. Alara watched them together, her heart swelling with a feeling so warm and powerful it frightened her. She was falling in love with him, and she was terrified it was a love that could never be returned. A year passed, a full circle of seasons. The city was once again draped in snow and festive lights. It was Christmas Eve. But this year, everything was different. Alara was not walking down a cold street with $10 and a heart full of fear. She was standing in a warm, beautifully decorated living room, watching the snow fall outside the large picture window. Her life was unrecognizable. She had a career she was proud of, a home that was safe and comfortable, and a son who was thriving. The constant grinding anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and security she had never thought possible. And she had Julian. Their friendship had deepened into a slow-burning, unspoken romance. They were a family in all but name. "I have something for you and Leo," Julian said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "Put your coats on." He drove them through the glittering city streets, not toward the upscale shopping districts, but back to the gritty, forgotten neighborhood where they had first met. Alara's heart began to beat a little faster. He parked the car and led them out into the cold. He walked them to the very bus stop where she had met Arthur. The metal bench was covered in a fresh layer of snow. The street was quiet. It looked exactly the same, yet it felt like a sacred place, the site of a miracle. "A year ago on this spot, my life changed," Julian said, his voice soft but clear in the cold air. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "I was lost, Alara, drowning in responsibility and loneliness. I had forgotten how to feel anything. And then I saw you. I saw you perform the most beautiful, selfless act I have ever witnessed." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his eyes shining with an emotion that took her breath away. "Your kindness to my father didn't just get him home safely that night. It showed me the way home, too. You and Leo. You are my home." Tears were streaming down Alara's cheeks, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. Leo stood beside them, watching with wide, serious eyes. "I love you, Alara," Julian said, his voice thick with feeling. "I love your strength, your compassion, your incredible heart. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Then, to her utter astonishment, he dropped to one knee in the snow. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside, a simple, elegant diamond ring glittered in the light from the street lamp. "Alara, will you marry me? Will you and Leo be my family, officially and for always?" For a moment, all she could do was cry, a flood of joy and disbelief and overwhelming love. She looked at Julian kneeling before her in the snow, offering her a future she had never dared to dream of. She looked at her son, who was beaming. "Well," Leo piped up, breaking the spell, "are you gonna say yes, Mommy?" A watery laugh escaped her. She nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she finally whispered, the word a puff of white in the cold air. "Yes, of course, yes." Julian slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. He stood up and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion and tenderness that sealed their promise. The final scene of their story unfolded a few days later in their warm, beautiful house. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. A magnificent Christmas tree stood in the corner, surrounded by a mountain of presents. The air was filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon and the sound of quiet, happy laughter. Arthur was there, sitting in a comfortable armchair, a soft blanket over his lap. He was having one of his good days, his eyes clear and his smile easy. He was watching Leo, who was happily playing with an enormous, elaborate train set that now occupied a significant portion of the living room. But on the table beside Arthur, placed in a position of honor, was the small, simple wooden train, Rory the Red Engine. Alara had found one just like the original and given it to Leo, a reminder of where their journey had begun. Leo had insisted Arthur keep it safe. Alara sat on the sofa, curled up against Julian, his arm wrapped securely around her. She watched the beautiful, chaotic scene of her new life, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She had gone from the depths of despair to this, a perfect moment of peace and love. It still felt like a dream. Julian leaned over and kissed the top of her head. "Happy?" he murmured into her hair. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "More than I ever thought was possible." She had given away her last $10, a small act of kindness, in a vast, indifferent city. She had expected nothing in return, and yet the universe had returned her sacrifice 1,000-fold, not with money, but with what truly mattered, a family, a purpose, and a love that had healed them all. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, quiet white, a symbol of the new, unblemished life that lay ahead of them.